All right, here we are with Chapter 6, which is a new nation. This is going to take us all the way up into Jefferson's presidency. It's another really long one. These two chapters are among the longest, so this isn't going to be the case for each of these. But again, hang in there. Chapter 6, a lot to cover here. So to introduce this chapter, to give you an idea of what's going on at this time, on July 4th, 1788, after independence has been won, Philadelphia hosts a parade in honor of the new nation and the new national constitution that was just passed. And a diverse group of people march, have people from all walks of life, different cultural groups, religious groups, and it really represented what many Americans hoped the United States would come. A diverse nation, but yet a cohesive nation, and a prosperous one at that. However, we're quickly going to see that the nation is not as cohesive as we would have hoped. And less than 2 years before, the nation actually had been on the brink of collapse. So our first government was not set up by the Constitution. Our first government was something completely different, and it was the Articles of Confederation, and it failed. So what is a confederation? A confederation is a type of government which forms a loose union among sovereign states. The central government in a confederation is extremely weak, and member states retain most of their sovereign powers. So for example, the United States is a confederation of sovereign nations. So the idea was, well, we didn't like the authoritarian approach that the British decided to put on us. Well, we're basically going to be our 13 independent colonies that are loosely tied together by this league of friendship. So, again, the U.S. begins as a confederation of sovereign states tied together by the Articles of Confederation under a firm league of friendship. And they created a deliberately weak central federal government because, again, they feared that they had a strong centralized authority that was too removed from the people. They're basically replacing one repressive government with another. They also feared that big states would dominate the government at the expense of smaller states. And I also felt that a representative Republican government would only work in small communities with common interests, meaning within the colonies themselves. That if they tried to do one big, large, strong federal government, then a representative republic wouldn't work in those circumstances. So the Articles of Confederation did create some kind of a central government. It was unicameral, meaning there was only one branch of government, and that branch was Congress. So Congress, their power is to make laws. So the members of Congress were elected by the state legislatures, so not the average people. And each state only had one vote, regardless of size, within the Congress. Now, they weren't entirely a failure. The Articles of Confederation did have three big accomplishments. Number one, the Revolutionary War. They are the government that is going to help successfully wage and win the American Revolution. They successfully negotiated that mutual defense treaty with France that pretty much enabled us to win the revolution. And they successfully negotiated the Treaty of Paris with favorable terms to the United States. And if you look at that map over there on the right, you can see before and after the revolution, everything in gold used to be that is British on the left. Now everything in pink belongs to the United States. So clearly very favorable terms. The second good thing they did was the Land Ordinance of 1785. And in this, they established uniform procedures for surveying Western lands into townships and sections, and also provided for the sale of public lands in the West at $1 an acre with the 640-acre minimum. So what this means is they set up how all the new land that is now part of the United States west of the Appalachian Mountains, so in between the Mississippi River and the Appalachian Mountains, how is that going to be organized into settlements? And very important, they reserved one section in each township to support public schools. And this is the first instance of federal aid to education, going back to John Locke's idea that everybody should have access to an education to produce rational human beings. And third is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. It established the orderly procedures for territories to become states that would be equal to the original 13. So again, this Northwest Territory that you see in the map over there to the right, those are going to become states, including the state of Illinois. So the Northwest Ordinance sets up how that's going to be happening. It's the same process that occurs today, or would occur today if we were to add a new state to the Union. Also very important, they banned slavery from the Northwest Territory, saying that this land could not be could not be formed into slave-owning states. And this is the first national law to prohibit the expansion of slavery. However, the Articles of Confederation obviously had some weaknesses and failure because they're no longer around. There was no power to tax among the Articles of Confederation, so that's pretty difficult. There's a lot of debts that the United States incurred as a result of the war, and how are we going to pay them back if we can't tax? Because, I don't know if you're aware, but the government pays for things through us, through our taxes. So anything that the government's going to do that's going to cost money is going to cost you and I through our taxes. And if they can't tax, they don't have any money. They also did not have the power to regulate interstate or foreign commerce. They couldn't regulate trade between the states or trade with other countries. They failed to restore the exports of rice, indigo, and tobacco to Great Britain, which is how a lot of people made their money, especially in the South. And they also, at the same time, allowed the British to flood the states with manufactured goods, creating a huge trade deficit. We are importing way more than we're exporting, and that's not a good thing. There was no executive branch, so they couldn't enforce any national policy, which is the job of the executive branch. And there was also no national leadership. There was no national judiciary, so there was no way to resolve any kind of disputes between the states. They issued inflated currency and failed to halt paper money abuses in Rhode Island and other states. And they lacked the flexibility needed for necessary changes. If they ever wanted to change anything within the Articles of Confederation, they needed an amendment which required a unanimous vote of all states. And if you can imagine our current Congress getting a unanimous vote on anything, you can have a pretty good idea of how difficult that action would be. So what's going to lead to the end of the Articles of Confederation? Well, the immediate cause is actually going to be a rebellion called Shays' Rebellion in 1787. So the economic situation in the United States is pretty bad, and it's affecting common people as well, particularly these farmers in western Massachusetts who were losing their farms because they couldn't repay their debts in hard currency. So they demanded that the state legislature halt the foreclosures on their properties, lower property taxes, and start issuing paper money so that they can pay back their debts. They are led by a former colonial captain by the name of Daniel Shays, hence Shays' Rebellion. And a group of armed farmers closed the courthouse where creditors were suing to foreclose farmers. And the national government was unable to put down this uprising, and it was a huge embarrassment to the government. Actually, a group of wealthy Bostonians had to raise an army to come in and put down this rebellion. And so it really reflected the tensions between very poor farmers and wealthy merchants, and it revealed that wealthy merchants really dominated the Massachusetts legislature, and what's more, that the federal government was very weak. Now, before this rebellion had even happened, states had sent delegates to the city of Annapolis to discuss trade problems between the states. They failed to resolve that problem, but they did decide to call for a convention to revise the articles so that they could cause the problem. And why Shays' Rebellion is important to this is because it frightened many conservatives into thinking that there was a breakdown of law and order. And this, as they called it, great commotion convinced important leaders like George Washington, James Madison, and others that the U.S. needed a stronger national government. Like, we have this great uprising of people and we couldn't even put it down. Like, individuals had to get together to put it down. Like, this is an embarrassment. What's going to stop more uprisings from happening again? So the Constitutional Convention occurs in Philadelphia. Delegates from 12 of the 13 states meet at the Pennsylvania State House in 1787. Their original instructions were to revise the Articles of Confederation, not to create a new government. And the biggest issue that they were trying to revise was that the federal government couldn't tax, and as a result, all the war debts incurred from the Revolutionary War were falling to the individual states, and it was very difficult for them to repay. Because state governments could tax, but the federal government could not. However, many leaders, including this man over here to the right, often referred to as the father of the Constitution, James Madison, had no intention of revising the Articles of Confederation. He wanted an entirely new constitution. He, in fact, had undertaken 2 research projects which were going to back up his views. Number 1 was a history of government in the United States, and number 2 was a history of republics around the world. And from this, he formulates what will largely become our Constitution. So eventually the framers realized that they need a completely new constitution to achieve their goal of forming a more perfect union. They can't revise the Articles of Confederation. They got to scrap it and start all over again. They believed that the government should be limited. They also believed that power should be divided among three branches of government, the legislative, executive, and judicial. And actually, they intended for the legislative branch to be the most powerful of the three branches. Power would be shared, but if one branch had to be the most powerful, they wanted the legislative branch. And we're going to see that change dramatically with the presidency of Andrew Jackson, so we'll get more to that later on. But that was the original intention, because the legislative branch was closer to the people. People voted directly for them, whereas the presidency a little bit more removed due to the Electoral College. I also believed in widespread ownership of property was a necessity to forming the foundation of a representative government. People owning land was very important to the founders. They opposed political parties, actually, which is surprising. They believed that political parties were vehicles of ambition and self-interest. And Madison also believed that a large republic would curb factionalism, as they call it. They didn't really call them political parties, they called them factions. And he felt that if we created this large republic, that it would help to stop factionalism, i.e. political parties, because all these different groups and viewpoints would make what he called a tyranny of the majority impossible. There are going to be compromises between big and small states, as well as free and slave states. The most famous between big and small states is the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise established that there would be two houses of Congress. Number one, the House of Representatives, which would be based on the population of the states, and that was in favor of large states. And two, the Senate, in which there would be two representatives per state, which would help out the small states. And they also declared that Congress had the power to levy taxes, declare war, which hasn't happened till since World War II, by the way, and regulate interstate trade. They also established a more powerful executive branch. Remember, there wasn't an executive branch at all in the Articles of Confederation. The executive branch here would be led by a president, and the Constitution required the president to deliver an annual State of the Union message to Congress. They also set up an electoral college to elect the president. They felt that this would be a safeguard against direct popular election for a president. They wanted to insulate the presidency from what they called excessive democracy. And you can see there is a fear among the founding fathers of this excessive democracy. We want democracy. We want a representative government, but we don't want too much involvement from the people. There was still this fear among the framers of the Constitution that the people could have too much power, and the people, could be whipped up into a frenzy by somebody who happened to be a good speaker, and he might get in power, and that could be dangerous because maybe it's not somebody who's the best. We need a check on that, right? We need a check on people who maybe aren't acting in the most educated way when voting. And so the Electoral College was meant to be. Nowadays, the Electoral College functions a little bit differently. So how it works today, if you aren't aware, in most instances, there are electors from each state. It's the number of people the state has in the House of Representatives plus 2, the number of people in the Senate. So it's the number of representatives that a state has in Congress. So more populous states mean they have more electoral votes. And whatever the popular vote is in that state for president, all the electoral votes go to that person. So that explains why you can lose the popular vote, which happened in 2016 and several other elections, but yet still win the presidency. They also set up an independent judiciary, which consisted of federal judges, which are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. And again, they hope to insulate the judiciary from popular control. And so they wanted to pretty much remove any kind of interaction between voting and judges. Judges aren't, in some instances, in local instances, they're voted on, but on the federal level, they're not. They're appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Of course, we vote for president and Senate, so we have a say in that way, but it's a step removed from the process. And the point here is that judges are supposed to be, as they called it, above the fray, above politics. They're there to interpret the law and nothing else. So they didn't want judges to be pandering to people, I guess, because they'd be afraid of losing an election. Power is also divided between the central government and the states in a what is called federalism. And they also established the very controversial Necessary and Proper Clause, which is often referred to as the Elastic Clause, which says that Congress has the power to make all laws necessary and proper for carrying out its enumerated powers. So it lists the powers of Congress, and then it also says, okay, they have these powers, but also they can make additional laws that aren't specifically listed here. Like they have powers that aren't specifically listed here. And the point of that was, we can't possibly know what the future holds. We don't know what the future is going to look like. So we don't want to be too specific. We want to allow the Constitution to be able to change over time, hence elastic clause, to bend and to move and to change. But this is often used in a way that some people disagree with, and we're going to get to that pretty shortly, actually. The Constitution also sets out a series of checks and balances, including the president can veto an act of Congress, but then Congress can override the presidential veto by a 2/3 vote in each house, which almost never happens. And also the president negotiates treaties that then can be ratified by the Senate. And of course, the judiciary, the Supreme Court in particular, can have that final say because of judicial review. But we're actually not at judicial review yet. We're going to talk about that later. So that's why I didn't put it here. There are some key provisions that were not in the original Constitution in 1787. So these are things that happened later on through amendments and other various requirements, but they weren't in the original Constitution of 1787. For instance, universal manhood suffrage. We already know women couldn't vote, but actually all white men couldn't vote either. Each state set its own requirements for voting. Pretty much they were limited to land-owning males until the 1830s when all white males were allowed to vote. There was no direct election of senators until the 17th Amendment of 1913, so state governments elected senators all the way up until 1913. The people didn't vote on them. There was no two-term limit for the president until the 22nd Amendment of 1951. And so that's why I put a picture of that man to the right. That's FDR. He is the only president to serve more than 2 terms in office. And after his presidency, that's when they passed the 22nd Amendment, officially limiting the president to 2 terms in office. Some more things that were not in the Constitution of 1787. There's no mention of political parties. Remember, I said this before, but the framers opposed political parties. They will emerge pretty much immediately after the Constitution is ratified during Washington's administration, largely due to Hamilton's very controversial economic program, which we're going to get to in a minute here. There's no mention of a presidential cabinet. It does say that the president has the power to appoint officials, and Washington really sets this precedent when he appoints a cabinet of 4 different individuals to advise and assist him. Nowadays, there are 14 executive departments and the attorney general there to advise the president. But that's just something that they've done because Washington did it. It's not actually in the Constitution. And there was originally no Bill of Rights. Federalists, who we're going to talk about here in a second, promised the addition of the Bill of Rights to make sure that the ratification of the Constitution occurred. And so Congress ratified the first 10 amendments to the Constitution collectively, and those, if you weren't aware, are referred to as the Bill of Rights, and they passed in 1791. The Constitution and slavery, very controversial. So a first emancipation, as we call it, is already occurring in the North. Northern states at this point have already either entirely eliminated or are in the process of gradually eliminating slavery. Also remember that the Articles of Confederation had excluded slavery from the Northwest Territory. And so as a result, at this point in time, slavery is really becoming a distinctly Southern institution. Probably the most controversial aspect of slavery that occurs in the Constitution is the Three-Fifths Compromise. There was a dispute between free and slave states as to how they would count slaves towards a state's population in terms of taxation and representation. Southern states, of course, wanted slaves to be counted towards representation. The more representatives you have in Congress, the more of a say you have, the more powerful you are. They have a lot of slaves. That gives them more representatives then. Free states are saying, oh, wait a minute. So you're saying that these slaves are your property, but now you're saying they should count towards your representation. You know, that's obviously very hypocritical. So the compromise was that slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person for taxation and representation purposes. This did increase congressional representation for slave states, though not as much as they intended, and also gave them a greater voice in the Electoral College. There was an additional provision requiring all states to return runaway to their masters, and it also stipulated that the importation of slaves could not end until 1808. So definitely not something that is a proud moment to point to in terms of the Constitution. An interesting quote here from Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams. She wrote this in a letter to her husband as he was at the Constitutional Convention. Sorry, not at the Constitutional Convention, as this was being created. In the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. So here she is pleading with her husband to ensure that women are given more of a voice in the government. Does it happen? No. Married women at this time had no legal identity apart from their husbands. They couldn't vote, hold political office, or serve on a jury. But this letter proves that some colonial women did seek to benefit from the Republican ideals of equality and individual rights espoused in the Constitution and espoused even before that in the Revolution. So that's not a really in-depth look at our government. If you're interested in learning more about it, take a poli-sci class. Again, this is just a survey class. We're giving you the broad strokes here. The proposed Constitution was sent to Congress, which then was meeting in New York. It included a cover letter written by George Washington saying basically, I'm George Washington and I approve this Constitution. And approval was officially needed from special state conventions, which would be called to ratify the Constitution. But almost immediately, critics organized to persuade voters to oppose the Constitution. And these critics have come to be known as anti-federalists. So what were the anti-federalist arguments against the Constitution? Well, they felt that it created a central government which was much too powerful. They felt that it threatened individual liberties. And they favored a more weak national government and stronger state government, similar to what was under the Articles of Confederation. They believed it gave too much power to the president and the Senate specifically, and they believed that both of these things were too removed from the people, because remember, the president is chosen by the Electoral College and the Senate by state legislatures. So their argument is, where's the average everyday person's voice in these two organizations? They also feel that it won't work in a large nation with diverse interests, and they believe that a republic best works in small, homogeneous nations, and so again, favoring stronger state governments as opposed to a stronger federal government. And Patrick Henry over here on the right was very vocal in the anti-federalist movement. He's the one who wrote the famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech, calling for America to declare independence from Great Britain. Those people who supported the Constitution were known as Federalists. Easy to remember, anti-federalists, anti means against. So anti-federalists were against it. Federalists for, FF. Federalists were for the Constitutions. They believed that this would work in a large nation. They were pro-ratification. They thought that this would create a very important republic that could work again in a large nation. They believed that it would help to fragment political parties, or again, factionalism, as they called it. They felt that it would curb the threat posed by the wealthy minority and the non-wealthy majority, that there would be a balance between the two. And they believed it would be just right. It was a federal government that was strong, but not too strong. And it would be able to preserve domestic tranquility, put down rebellions like Shays' Rebellion quickly and easily. And so in order to get everybody on board with the Constitution and make everybody okay with it, the Federalists decided to write the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers were a collection of newspaper editorials written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, and they wrote under a pseudonym, so they didn't write under their own names. And basically what these did is they challenged conventional political wisdom and argued that a large republic offered the best protection of minority rights. Because again, people are afraid that they're exchanging one repressive government for another. We just threw off the British government for being too repressive and taking away our rights. What's going to stop this new strong central government from doing the same thing? So I'd like to call your attention specifically to Federalist number 10. And this newspaper editorial, James Madison wrote it, and he argued that political factions, again, political parties, were undesirable but inevitable. And he felt that a large republic with 3 branches of government would be able to disperse the power of factions, political parties. So the original Constitution did outline specific rights for some people and some restrictions on government authority. For instance, it said the new government could not grant titles of nobility. We have no lords and ladies here. And it couldn't require a religious oath for holding federal office. So there's no religious requirement for holding federal office, meaning you can't be told, oh, sorry, you can't serve in this particular office because of your religion. It doesn't matter because we have no official religion in the United States. That is not a barrier to you becoming any member of the federal government. The Anti-Federalists also objected, however, to the absence of a Bill of Rights. They felt that there needed to be a more specific list of what the government can't do to you. Like, what are your rights that the government can't infringe on? So the Federalists pledged that the first Congress would draw up such a Bill of Rights, and they did. All right. So Washington's election as president pretty much cemented the Constitution's authority. It's here to stay, it's been ratified, we're good to go. And his first cabinet that he appointed to power reflected the continuation of these political tensions over the size and power of the federal government. And that's really the main dividing point between our current political parties today. Republicans favor a smaller central government and Democrats favor a larger central government. And so it continues to be entirely relevant even today. And it was relevant back there. So his vice president is John Adams, and his secretary of the Treasury is Alexander Hamilton, now made famous by the musical. They were both active in promoting government prosperity through industry. So they wanted to see America turned into a very industrious nation. The Industrial Revolution is underway in Great Britain. They want to get on the bandwagon there. They want to promote industry in America. But Washington's Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson had an entirely different view of what America should look like. He wanted to restrict federal power. He wanted a smaller central government, a very limited central government, and he wanted to preserve an economy that was based on agriculture. He wanted a nation in which everyone would be able to own their own land and farm it, and that was his vision for America. All right, Hamilton is going to really solidify these differences, though, into political parties because of his financial program. So Hamilton believed that a federal government should be a repository of the rights of the wealthy. He very much favored that, as he phrased it himself, the rich, well-born, and able should be the ones running things, which is interesting because Hamilton actually started off life very poor. He was an illegitimate son. He was born in the Caribbean, came to the United States, and really had to work his way up the ladder all on his own. And yet he really favored, as I said, the rich, well-born, and able running things. Whereas then you have Jefferson. Jefferson, born the son of a wealthy Southern planter, silver spoon in the mouth and all that, and he's going to have the opposite view. So it's interesting how their backgrounds affected them there. So how to achieve this? Well, he sets out a financial plan which will achieve his vision for America. He wants to strengthen the national finances and promote economic growth. He wants to give propertied and financial classes, i.e. the rich people, a stake in the success of the new government. And he wants to move the country away from reliance on agriculture and to an economy that's based on commerce and manufacturing. So how, again, to achieve this? Well, he wants to fund the federal debt at face value. So he wants to assume all state debts incurred at the Revolution, take all those debts and put them in one lump sum and pay that sum off. He wants the federal government to do this. This would increase our credit among other nations, prove that we're able to pay our debts, and so other nations will then be more likely to loan and do businesses with us. And he also wants to adopt an excise tax on liquor to help fund payment debts. Again, that's how the government gets money, through taxes. He also wants to impose tariffs on imported goods, which would protect America's new industries. Again, he's all about American industry, and tariffs are essentially taxes on imported goods. So the idea there is we make the imported goods more expensive, we make the American goods cheaper, people will buy the American goods, American industry will prosper. And in order to do all this, he wants to establish a national bank, which will help to provide a stable currency and be a source of capital for loans to fund the development of businesses and commerce. However, the question comes up pretty quickly, is a national bank constitutional? Well, Congress does pass it, even though James Madison objects. And Washington, before he signs this bill allowing the national bank to be a reality, asks Jefferson and Hamilton to write their opinions on the constitutionality of the bank bill, basically saying to them, convince me of your position. And this is really the first debate on constitutional interpretation. And we see two groups forming. Those who are strict constructionists who believe the federal government can only do things specifically written in the Constitution. If it's not there, nope, they can't. And then you have broad constructionists who believe that the federal government has powers not explicitly stated in the Constitution, referring again to that necessary and proper clause. Well, it might not explicitly state it, but does it fall under that necessary and proper? Is it necessary and proper to ensuring the welfare of the American people? And actually, this is entirely relevant because this was actually used, the necessary and proper clause was cited when they debated the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. They argued that they had to argue whether or not it was necessary and proper for the government to mandate that you have health care. So it's something that is still relevant. All right, Jefferson, not surprisingly, didn't like the national bank. He was very much against it. He did not believe the bank was necessary, and he was very much against it because he said the Constitution does not specifically authorize Congress to make a bank. And his viewpoint was what the Constitution does not permit, it forbids. So strict constructionist, if it's not in there, we can't do it. He believed that states, not Congress, have the power to charter banks. Hamilton believed that the Constitution gave Congress the power to tax and regulate trade, again, and because of that, a bank was necessary to carry out these powers. So pointing to the necessary and proper clause, it's saying that it gave Congress an implied power to charter a national bank. Because if Congress has the power to tax and regulate trade, they need a bank to carry that out, and thus it's implied that we can charter a bank. And his viewpoint is what the Constitution does not forbid, it permits. So as long as the Constitution says the government can't do it, then the government can do it. And Thomas Jefferson had this to say in his argument against the national bank. To take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power, no longer susceptible to any definition. Very much strong in favor of a weak central government, firmly with firm boundaries outlined by the Constitution. Well, Hamilton wins this argument. Washington does sign the bank bill into law, chartering the first national bank of the United States. And Hamilton's broad constructionist interpretation is going to set a precedent for a very large expansion of federal power over time. So remember, part of Hamilton's economic program was this tax on whiskey. And not surprising, given our history with taxes in terms of leading up to the Revolution, a lot of people were really mad about the tax on whiskey. It provoked a lot of resistance and evasions, and farmers, particularly in western Pennsylvania, started resorting to some very revolutionary-like tactics, doing things like tarring and feathering federal tax collectors, stopping court proceedings of those who are put on trial for evading the tax. They blew up the stills of those who were paid. In fact, the term bootlegger actually comes from the Whiskey Rebellion. These people who were trying to evade the tax would hide the whiskey in flasks attached to their legs under their boots, hence bootlegger. So Washington decides to call out a 12,000 strong group of militiamen to put down this rebellion, and he is able to do so quickly and easily. And so this shows the strength of the new government, and it also shows that it's no longer acceptable to challenge the government using revolutionary tactics. Right, so Washington faces some pretty serious foreign threats pretty quickly early on in his presidency. So the French Revolution is going on at this time in France, and it's going to lead to a prolonged war with Great Britain that only ends with the defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. So it goes on a long time. Remember that we have an alliance with France at the time. The Franco-American Alliance of 1778 helped us to win the American Revolution. It made us allies. And in return, we were supposed to defend French possessions in the West Indies. And so the French are calling on the Americans to aid them in their war against Great Britain. And Washington realizes that this is not a good idea. We are a young nation. We are a nation that is not economically stable at the time. We have no business getting dragged into a foreign war and spending all this money that we don't have, and we're just not ready for it. But how to get out of this treaty? Well, he issues a neutrality proclamation on April 22nd, 1793, saying we're going to be friendly and impartial towards the belligerent powers, i.e. France and Great Britain. So we're not taking sides. And he argued that the original treaty we signed with France in 1778 was with King Louis XVI, and the revolutionaries had cut off King Louis XVI's head and taken control of the government, and so he's dead, and our treaty no longer holds, and so now we're going to be neutral. Well, the British aren't very happy about this, and on top of it all, the British aren't very happy with us because, you know, we won the revolution. So British-U.S. relations remained pretty strained. The British still refused to evacuate forts that they held in the Northwest Territory, and British royal commanders were also seizing U.S. trading ships in the French West Indies. They were taking the ships, taking all the sailors aboard, and making them join the British Navy in a policy known as impressment. About that. But instead of declaring war, which again, Washington's like, we have no business going to war, Washington sends Chief Justice John Jay to London to negotiate a treaty with Great Britain to avoid war. And in this treaty, known as Jay's Treaty, the British do agree to evacuate the Northwest Territory and pay damages for ships that had been seized. However, they refused to renounce the right to make future seizures. And on the flip side, we also had to agree to pay debts owed to British merchants on pre-revolutionary accounts. So it's not a really good treaty for us. However, Jay's Treaty did have some important diplomatic consequences. Number one, it does keep the peace with Great Britain. On the other side, though, it strains relations with France, which are already strained because we didn't honor our treaty to help them. And on the plus side, however, it prompts Spain to sign another favorable treaty with us. They feared that Jay's Treaty foreshadowed an Anglo-American alliance between the United States and Great Britain, and so they wanted to establish friendly relationships with us as well. So they signed Pinckney's Treaty in 1795, allowing us to have free navigation of the Mississippi River, which was then in Spanish control, and to have the right to deposit goods at New Orleans, which was then in Spanish control as well. New Orleans was in the control of Spain for a while. We tend to think of it as a French territory, and it was, but it was also in the control of Spain for a time. Jay's Treaty, however, had significant domestic consequences. A lot of people were really against it. You know, how could you sign this treaty that's not very favorable to us with Great Britain when we just fought a war against them? They're enemy number one. Jefferson was very much against it. Jefferson supported the French Revolution. He was angry that we did not get involved to help out the French against the British. He saw them as being, you know, on the same level as us. They're fighting a revolution. We fought a revolution. So he's mad about this. They were angry that they were forced to pay the lion's share of pre-revolutionary debts, while at the same time, merchants from New England were able to collect damages from their seized ships. And this fight over the treaty shows this growing divide between Hamilton's Federalist Party and Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, which are going to be our two first political parties, which we're going to talk about. So Washington, as he leaves office in 1796, saw what was happening and offered some advice to Americans as he left. He really did not want future American leaders to have any kind of permanent alliances with foreign nations. And this was something he really feared, us getting dragged into wars that had nothing to do with us. And this is going to be used as a justification in a lot of different parts of our history. It's used after World War I to justify our refusal to support the League of Nations, despite the fact that American President Woodrow Wilson basically created the League of Nations. And it's also used during the 1930s to support our isolationist policy during the buildup of World War II. So again, there's no mention of political parties in the Constitution, but within Washington's administration, these political parties are going to form around Hamilton and Jefferson. Hamilton's political party are called the Federalists, and Jefferson's are the Democratic Republicans. And the question of how the U.S. should respond to the French Revolution furthered that division. The Federalists supported Great Britain, whereas the Republicans supported. So what did these political parties generally believe? Now, I'll outline their basic views on things. And the tendency, I feel like, is when we look back at these political parties of old, for people to be like, oh, well, this one is like the Democratic Party and this one's like the Republican Party. And it's very important that you try not to do that. These political parties were, again, refer back to that quote I used in the previous chapter, that the past is like a foreign country. Like we have things going on in our world now, and we're concerned with things now that didn't exist back then. And so each political party is going to have some elements of each of the current political parties. So just think of them as their own little entities and don't try to draw a comparison between the two, because you're going to get confused. All right. So the Federalists are led by Alexander Hamilton and John Adams. They draw most of their support from the New England region, so they're a political party that has a lot of support in the north, and also eastern port cities, because they promote commercial interests. So it just makes sense for them. They promote policies that help them. They support the National Bank and the protective tariffs. They're focused on the commercial interests of the United States, and they favor the British over the French. The Democratic Republicans are led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They are supported mainly by Southerners and frontier farmers because that's who their policies support. They're very much in favor of agriculture. They want a very weak central government, a strict interpretation of the Constitution. They opposed the National Bank and the protective tariffs and favored agricultural interests and favored an alliance with France over the British. All right, so our second president is going to be John Adams. He is a Federalist, and he inherits a pretty messy situation. Basically, the United States at this point is in a quasi-war with France, like an undeclared war with France. By the mid-1797, the French have plundered 300 American merchant ships. And in response, Congress suspends all commerce with France, saying, if you're going to plunder our ships, we're not trading with you at all, cutting off all trade with you. In response, the Americans then create a Navy department and enlarge the Army and renounce the Franco-American Alliance of 1778, basically gearing up for war here. That's what they're doing. But still, Adams is going to resist the pressure to declare war on France. He believes, like Washington, that we are not in the position to enter into a war at this point. And instead of that, he decides to send envoys to France. So the revolutionary government that took over from King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette had essentially failed. It had gone through several incarnations. And in the end, Napoleon Bonaparte becomes dictator of France. And Bonaparte has no interest in fighting a war with the United States. I mean, we are not the United States of today at this point. We're pretty insignificant on the world stage. And he's like, I don't have time to waste for this. I'm basically trying to conquer all of Europe. So let's sign a peace treaty. So I can focus a war on Great Britain. And so war with France is avoided at this point. But while all this is going on, the Federalists decide to take advantage of the anti-French feeling and this surge in American patriotism and pass a series of very controversial laws. The first was the Naturalization Act, which raised the residency requirement for people to become American citizens from 5 to 14 years. But what was really controversial were the Alien and Sedition Acts. So the Alien Act authorized the president to deport any dangerous aliens. And of course, by this, I don't mean aliens from outer space. I mean aliens as in people from other countries. So let's say we were to go to war with France. The president under this act would have the power to deport French citizens back home or people of French descent. The Sedition Act made it illegal to speak, write, or print any statement about the president that would bring him into contempt or disrepute. And this was seen as an infringement on your freedom of speech. If you can't say something that's critical about the president, then isn't that curtailing your freedom of speech? In the same way of the Alien Act, if the president can deport you just because you're from a country that we happen to be at war at, doesn't that infringe? That doesn't seem like something that really goes along with our rights. And so not everybody was happy with these. Not surprisingly, Jefferson and Madison were not happy with this, those members of the opposite political party. The Federalists at the time controlled all three branches of the federal government, and so there really wasn't much they could do other than write about how mad they were, and that's what they did. They felt that the Alien and Sedition Acts were a threat to individual liberty, and so they anonymously wrote a series of resolutions called the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions because they were approved by the Virginia and Kentucky state legislatures. And these resolutions denounce the Alien and Sedition Acts, and they formulate what's known as a states' rights doctrine, which says that states retain the power to challenge and, if necessary, nullify federal laws. This is going to be extremely important later on when we talk about John C. Calhoun and the nullification crisis of 1830. And really it goes beyond that and goes all the way into the Civil War. And that is what role do states have in terms of the federal government? Like if a federal law goes against something that a state believes to be right, can the states nullify or cancel that law? So that's going to be something important to remember later on. And here Jefferson and Madison are saying, yes, they do. The states do have the right to nullify or cancel out a federal law that they believe to be wrong. So Jefferson narrowly defeats John Adams in the election of 1800, ending the Federalist decade. And this is a key turning point in American political history, and it's referred to as the Revolution of 1800 because it's the first peaceful transfer of power between the victorious Democratic Republicans and the defeated Federalists. Because Washington wasn't a member of any political party. He tended to side with Hamilton and the Federalists, but he tried to be above the political parties. He saw them forming and he wasn't happy about it. So there wasn't a transfer of power there. This is the first real transfer of power from one political party to another. And it was peaceful. And so it showed that it was possible to have that transfer of power between political parties. In his inaugural address, Jefferson stressed that there were essential principles of American government that were above party politics. And he said famously, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." And this part of this election of 1800 is also another very important development. So when Jefferson comes in office, he in some ways really works to decrease federal influence. But on the other side, in another branch of government, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court John Marshall, who is actually a relation to Thomas Jefferson, worked to increase the authority of the Supreme Court. And how he did it was through the case of Marbury versus Madison. So what happened? Well, the night before leaving office in 1801, John Adams appointed several justices of the peace. And these were referred to as his midnight appointments because it happened at night, on his last night in office. And his purpose was to try to put Federalists in vacant federal positions to block the power of the incoming Democratic Republicans. And so not surprisingly, Jefferson and his Secretary of State, James Madison, refused to deliver the appointments. And several of the appointees, including William Marbury, sued the government, saying we have the right to our appointments. So the court rules in favor of the Jefferson administration, actually, even though these two were adversaries. But it goes further than that, and this is the important part. It says that the Supreme Court reserves the right to decide if an act of Congress violates the Constitution, establishing the very important concept of judicial review, saying that the Constitution is that the Supreme Court has the power to interpret the Constitution, that if Congress passes an act and somebody questions its constitutionality, they have the authority to decide whether it's constitutional or not. This is a huge power of the Supreme Court. It really gives them the final say over laws, because if they declare a law unconstitutional, it's gone. All right, so to conclude, a debate over political party really is going to engulf the young United States. The Constitution does ensure a strong federal government, and whether or not it's too strong and how strong it should be is a debate that continues even to today. The federal government has the power to tax, wage war, make laws, and so it's very important to determine, how much power should they have over those things. However, at the time, it still couldn't resolve the young nation's many conflicting constituencies, but the Whiskey Rebellion proved that the nation could stifle dissent, and it exposed a new threat to liberty in the process. However, the dissension among people is only going to deepen over time. Leading to our chapter question for Chapter 6, which is, who had the better vision for America, Jefferson or Hamilton? Citing specific examples, of course, explain why. And that is the end of yet another long chapter, Chapter 6.